Thank you all for joining us today. We expect many more that will be joining us here in a few minutes, but this is part of our annual, I should say our biannual legislative series, which is sponsored by 9 different organizations. Our gold sponsors are Atmos Energy, Children's Health, Dallas College, HNTB, Encore, and Spectrum. And our silver sponsors are UTD, Polzanelli, and Reliant Energy. So we can't thank them enough. This is a 9-part series. We kicked off with our legislative preview back in December that featured Senator Nathan Johnson and Representative Jeff Leach, giving us their insights into what they were expecting to happen. Of course, it was a different time just a month ago relative to budget surpluses, but nevertheless, this is the first event actually during the session, and we'll expect to do 7 more of these and get perspectives from a multitude of people and views on what's happening within the session and what we can expect to see between now and the conclusion of the session. So thank you all for being here. We sincerely appreciate it. And thank you to all of our sponsors for their efforts. What I'd like to do real quickly now is turn it over to one of our sponsors, Erica Akpan. She represents NRG Energy. She's with Government Affairs at NRG Energy, which is the parent company of Reliant Energy. She's a graduate of Texas State and has a Master of Public Affairs at from UT, and she served as a staff member for multiple legislators, making her the ideal person to introduce our comptroller. So Erica, why don't you take it away?
Thank you, Ken. I just wanted to give a little bit of background about Glenn Hegar, who was elected as the 36th Texas Comptroller of Public Accounts in November 2014. And as such, he's the CFO of the world's 9th largest economy within the state of Texas. In his time as comptroller, he's worked to improve the efficiency of that state agency. He's formed the nation's first state-administered precious metals depository. He's founded the Transparency Stars program, which recognizes Texas local governments that provide the public with detailed information on various aspects of their finances. And he continues to bring public and legislative attention to long-term financial obligations facing the state, such as healthcare coverage for public school teachers and employees, infrastructure maintenance, and state employee pensions. But perhaps one of his most important, or at least most publicized responsibilities, is providing the legislature with the revenue estimate. Before his election as comptroller, he served in the Texas House and Senate, where he worked on policy issues regarding public education, transportation, tax reform, water, and tort reform. Glenn Hegar is a proud graduate of Texas A&M and a 6th-generation Texan who grew up farming with his family. And I believe it's this hardworking background that developed his no-nonsense, salt-of-the-earth approach to significant and important issues facing our state. And I'll just leave you with one last tip. You should probably pay attention to the Aggie football schedule from the months of September through December if you have a meeting with him, because that's going to determine how your meeting goes. And with that, I'll leave you proud to introduce our comptroller, Glenn Hegar.
Thank you, Erica. Yeah, because my wife and kids, we go to a lot of the games, and let's just say we were hopefully we'll be in a better mood next year than we were this year. So, or last year.
I hope so.
But it's good to be with all of you. Thanks for joining me today, and look forward to some of the questions that you may have. But let me talk real quick about kind of the revenue estimate that I provided on Monday, kind of what led us up to the announcement of yesterday and of earlier this week of Monday, how we got to where we're at, some of the caution that I'm providing to legislators, and then some of the different priorities that they may be focusing on. So just to kind of as a backdrop, if you look at state revenues and for our state budget, just kind of real quickly from an overtop, most of you know this, but the state budget, 2/3 of it is state income, one third of it is really federal income. And so therefore, when I talk about the revenue estimate of the next 2-year budget cycle, constitutionally, I'm required to tell them an update of what we think will come in the Treasury for the next 2-year budget on the day before legislative session. I've said that this revenue estimate that I provided this week is undoubtedly the most difficult that we have ever worked on. In fact, there's a lot of first times in this revenue estimate with a lot of different moving pieces of some of the numbers and where money is supposed to go based on the assumptions that we put into this revenue estimate. Also, it's one of the hardest because in one part, the cash carryover balance that I had announced on Monday is the largest cash carryover balance we've ever had in Texas history from one current budget cycle to the next. But then also in the same estimate, I'm using that word recession and talking about that Texas probably later this year will be subject to a mild recession. We don't think it'll be very wide, it'll be very deep. But if you look at the forces around the global economy, the Fed raising the interest rate, inflationary pressures, a lot of uncertainty that's in the global economy, we feel as though those headwinds are strong enough and the clouds are enough on the horizon that Texas will have to, unfortunately, have some type of mild recession. And so on one part, recession, largest cash carryover balance in Texas history, those two just don't make sense to put together into one. And so trying to explain that in itself, much less to explain some of the complexities of the first time. When my staff went over Monday morning and briefed leadership staff, as well as legislative budget board staff, those that are really into the weeds like we are and know the budget moving in and out, much like my staff does, so many faces in that room were sitting there with a puzzled look on their face going, we've never seen that before. That is a new. When I was talking to one of the top appropriators on Monday night, and they just said, well, I asked the staff a question and they said, but we've never seen this before. And that legislator said, yeah, but we need to know the answer to it. And so in a way, we've had a several month jump on what they're trying to figure out because we've been working on those questions. And to my poor staff's chagrin, in a way, I was still texting and emailing them on Sunday night at 9 and 9:30 as I was working up to try to make sure I had tell the story. You know, what is the story here? And the story is, if you look at the state budget, what we think will come in the state treasury, and obviously it's going to be subject to change. Texas is the 9th largest economy in the world. We're very inclined to the world economy. We grow 1,000 people a day. You know this in the Metroplex with the growth that has occurred, not just in people, but also in businesses relocating and expanding in Texas. The Metroplex has substantially benefited over the course of the last decade and will continue to in that economic growth. But if you look at that $342 billion in total dollars, people then want to hear about, let's carve the federal money out because there's no discretion over that. And then of the state money, well, we really need to carve out dedicated dollars. So streams that come in, but they're dedicated to a specific purpose. Now, the legislature may or may not appropriate all those monies, but they don't really have discretion over it. So then let's talk about the discretionary dollars, which is, as we said, $189 billion of the 342. But then, well, yeah, they have discretion, but then there's a thing called public education, which is a constitutional right. There's a thing called Medicaid, which is an entitlement. Those are the two biggest pieces of the state budget. And then we have higher education, and we have criminal justice and transportation funding. And so really, they can change some of the formulas of how those dollars are allocated, but they really don't, at the end of the day, have discretion to get rid of it. And so therefore, then the focus really becomes on what is the cash carryover balance? And that cash carryover balance is a record $32.7 billion, or just around $33 billion. I mean, it is an astronomical amount of money. As a former appropriator, as a former legislator, you like to have money, but I will say as an appropriator, it's a lot easier when you have no money because you only had to say one word, and that's called no. Great idea. I love that idea. Thank you so much, but we don't have any money. Or if you have a little bit, but this one, I really do feel sorry for the appropriators because you can't say no. And if you do say no, people are going to, but you're sitting on a record amount of $33 billion. And so therefore, how did we get here? We got here because tax collections in Texas, 60% essentially almost of all tax collections are sales tax. So we talk more about sales tax than any other tax. Pre-pandemic, we had about a handful of months where we had $3 billion or above in sales tax collections. And that doesn't include motor vehicle sales tax. That's a separate account that we talk about those sales tax items. So just the normal items that you and I purchase. But in the last 18 months, we've hit a $3 billion every single month. In fact, the last 2 months, we almost hit $4 billion. We were just shy of $4 billion at very high 3.9 billion. We've averaged 3.8. So we've had very robust sales tax collections is the point. We've also had very robust tax collections in motor vehicle sales tax collections, robust severance tax collections, record amounts in oil and gas severance tax collections than we've ever had before. We've had robust months in all of these. So here's one point just to make. When I was trying to figure out how do I message some of this and how do I message the dollars that we told them they had at the fall of last year when we updated our estimate, I was trying to figure out how do I message this and how did it grow? And I've been talking about how it was growing. I was managing expectations, but we didn't say the exact number of growth, and very few people are, in the weeds to add that up. And so I've been managing that expectation that it was growing, but how do I say, how do we get here? Here's one number to remember. If you look back in the last 3 decades, 5 times in those 3 decades have we had where Texas total tax collections in one fiscal year compared to the prior one had a double-digit increase. So double-digit increase from this year compared to the prior year. Those 5 times range between 10 to 13% increases. Very healthy growth. When we closed the books at the end of August of last year and started September 1, which was our new fiscal year, in the 12 months, we had total tax collections compared to the year before had increased 25.6%. So in other words, they were double almost what we had ever had for the record we have had in the last 30 years. So that's one reason when I laid out the revenue estimate, one word of caution was to the appropriators, do not expect me to be back and announce in 2 years from now a revenue estimate of a cash carryover balance like this. This is once in a lifetime budgeting session, which is the only thing they have to do, an astonishing opportunity to prioritize spending this legislative session, not just in this 2-year budget, but also in the upcoming years. And the reason I say in upcoming years is because normally every legislative session, the only number that matters is the one that I provide them or the controller he or she provides. That is the predominating number. But every so often, the economy in those 2 years had grown so much that the cash carryover balance is big enough, and the economy is going to grow in the next 2 years, that then they actually have more money than they can spend under what's called the constitutional spending limit. And that's where we're at today. So they, in fact, cannot appropriate or spend all the money they have without taking a majority vote in the House and the Senate to what's called bust the spending cap. I have not known in my 20 years around this process of any legislative body, Republican or Democrat, that wants to quote unquote go home and say, you know what, we busted the spending cap. That sounds awful. They're not going to do it. So therefore, they're in the position. Do they go home and vote and bust the spending cap, or which in part go, well, just provide it in tax relief? Well, in fact, typically, unless you cut revenue streams coming in, the other way, and most people, the biggest discussion point among most people in Texas is property taxes. The way you can impact property taxes is you add additional dollars into the school funding formulas, which means you raise state spending to lower local expenditures of property taxes, and that's an increase in state expenditures. And so therefore, that's, as one to-be member who's now a member was called me and asked and said, oh, so we can't do that. And I said, oh, no, you can do it. You just have to bust the constitutional spending limit. And he goes, oh, we're not going to do that. And I said, yeah, I know that. So they're part and part that dilemma between they actually have more money than they can spend under the constitutional spending limit. So I had asked my team, what is something that they can do? Because we've never been in this historical position before. And one of the things that was told to me, which I had talked about on Monday, I've talked about since then, because when it was first announced to me, is you can essentially, they can take money out of what's say the general treasury, which is our checking account. They can move it over and start a new savings account, which is a separate line item and an account that they can create in the state treasury. But that savings account doesn't have check writing or expenditure authority. And so by creating it, you don't actually spend the money, which means it counts to the spending limit, but you actually have it over to the side for a specific purpose. Whatever that purpose may be, could be infrastructure funding, could be healthcare related, could be public education, could be property tax relief. And then what happens is in future years, those dollars come back in they are appropriated when you don't have the spending limit. And you go, well, why would you do that? Well, one of the things is, one of the issues, and I was on doing a virtual meeting just a minute ago. One of the former Health and Human Service commissioners had asked the question about reimbursement rates for healthcare, but obviously you increase those rates, which, well, obviously one of the things that I mentioned in my estimate is things that I think are very important, whether that's state salaries for state employees because of inflationary pressures, teachers, nurses. Now, not all these people are state employees, but the state can impact funding streams that can help relieve some of those pressures, as well as skilled trades that we need. And so therefore that does incur ongoing cost into the future as you increase those rates, for example. But with that being said, if you do that, then you have dollars that can be able to pay for those costs in the future years. And that's one of the dilemmas the legislature is always in, is we want to do that, but I don't know how we're going to pay for it in 2 years, 4 years, 6 years. And so I threw out that idea because I think it's something that will be able to do that. Now, one last thing I want to mention, and then I'll stop and open it up for questions. In the last 18 months, the main driver is the health of the state economy. Another driver, unfortunately, is because people are paying more for taxable items than they were a year ago because of inflation. Just to make a point, you, myself, businesses on taxable items, Glenn Hegar collected $3.9 billion last month in sales tax, the month before in sales tax, close to that amount the month before. But of each of those 3 months, we as consumers, individuals and businesses on taxable items, that doesn't include obviously groceries, doesn't include medication, those are non-taxable, but those also have inflationary pressures too. But just for me, in the Treasury, a little over $850 million of my $3.9 billion I collected. Why? Because people were paying more for those same items than they did the year before. And so what does that translate into? That translates into each of those months of the last 3 months, people literally paid for those same taxable items $4.5 billion more than they did a year ago. So in the last year, for just taxable items, that's $45 billion. And so I make that point in part because I want to stress to the legislature, for example, my employees, I have a lot of employees that are not very highly paid, and they are struggling more than they ever have before. And so I think, salaries, other things that we can do are extremely important, because we have to have these people to provide customer service to the people that we serve, which is businesses and taxpayers. And so I bring that point up because it does raise, unfortunately, the cost of doing business for individuals, for business, and the state needs to have that front and center on their mindset. So let me stop there. Questions, comments, complaints, what do y'all have for me?
Well, thank you, Comptroller Hegar. I've got a question from Lee Kleinman from Master Plan. Lee, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Comptroller. Appreciate you being here today. It's always very interesting, and we appreciate that, at least from you, we just get the straight story, and then it's up to the legislature to figure it out. Has there been any discussion about reducing sales tax rate, even on a temporary basis, to give some inflation relief?
Yeah, there has been. One of the things that was discussed, but they were out of session, is whether we just get rid of the motor fuels tax. For example, when you go to the pump, 20 cents roughly is federal tax, 20 cents of that roughly is state tax. I think 20 and 19, but I never can remember which one's 20 and which one's 19. But the fact is, you could do that, but we're not in session, and I don't have that authority. And so therefore, some of the discussion has been, and that's why I mentioned earlier, is that when you deal with tax relief, if you lower the rate, that doesn't count to the spending limit, because it just means less revenue coming in. And so that lowering rates, and that's why several sessions ago on the franchise or the margins tax, for example, back in 2013, if I recall correctly, when the legislature, I know because I was dealing with this on the Senate side, there was the House side, their proposal was cuts to specific areas. And I just want to do a flat across the board cut it 25%. It's easy for calculation. It's easy for business. It's easy for my office, even though I wasn't here at the time. It's simplistic. Just a rate is simple. And then you don't pick winners and losers. The state's not in that business. And so you can do that. That is an easy way to impact people significantly and quickly. But I would say also that discussion is not just in sales tax, that discussion's in franchise and other areas as well. Great question, Lee. Thank you for that.
Looks like we've got a question from Amanda Rockow from UT Dallas. Hi, Amanda.
How are you, Glenn?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm great. I've heard a lot of talk about how maybe there is a way to be able to give tax relief, property tax relief, without it counting toward the spending limit. Is there any other way around it?
Yeah, another way is to model kind of what we did with what would I call the state's water infrastructure fund here several years ago. One of those was we took, and I was in the legislature at the time, we took $2 billion out of the state savings account, the rainy day fund. And just that money goes in there based on oil and gas severance taxes, not all of it, but a piece of it. And so therefore that fund today has $13 billion in it, a little over. Under our current projections, it'll have about 27 billion if we're having this conversation 2 years from now. But let me just say, I always caution that oil and gas severance taxes are extremely volatile. I have a chart that I provide to the legislature that shows the last 30 years. And at the bottom, I think the average increase is a little over 9% a year. And I challenge them. The trick is to look up and down and find me one single digit increase or decrease from one year to the next. That's the trick question, because there is none. It's very volatile, and it's always double-digit increases or decreases. And so therefore, I use that as an illustration, then bring home the point. Thank God we don't budget off this. We put it in our state savings account. And so my only point being is I'm confident in the numbers we provide today, but that's a very volatile stream. And so therefore it could be more or less. But the point being is coming back to answer your question, the legislature took $2 billion out of the rainy day fund many sessions ago to move over for water infrastructure funding. And that was done via constitutional amendment. And as it was done as a constitutional amendment, and we as the voters approved it, the legislature, that was the first time it was done. And it was recognized as, okay, that doesn't count to the spending limit because it was done outside and it was done through the rainy day fund. So
Okay.
that's a historical precedent that was done one time.
So the way to do it, to not have it count against the spending limit, would be to put it to the voters and use the rainy day fund.
So that's one. My staff, I asked them this question and they gave me about, I think it was 3 or 4 different scenarios. That was one. Another one was the way that I mentioned, but that's for spending in out years. It's not spending immediately to now, but to me, one of the concerns that I have, I've been around long enough and I got some gray hair to show for it, is that you appropriate, and then how do you pay for it in 2 and 4 years? And as a CFO, that's my biggest concern. In part is I want sustainability. I don't want to come back in 2 years and go, oh, that was a great idea, and I wish we wouldn't have done it. Now, how do we unwind that? And so that's one reason I advocate that idea, as it may not put funding in there now, but it helps pay for it. It may give a portion of that funding now, which it does increase it, but it also gives a stream in future years. So those are 2 ways. There's a couple other ways my staff mentioned as well, possibly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, Glenn, this is Ken Malcolmson. So we all know that such a large percentage of our budget is related to health and human services. And we also know that there's not much of an appetite to expand Medicaid. But one of the arguments against expanding Medicaid was the fact that it required a contribution in order to release the funding from the federal government. Yeah. Would this change with this surplus? Do you think this might have any potential of changing any legislators' attitudes about this?
That's a great question, and I'm stretching because I'm grabbing my tablet to write down that question. I don't know the answer to your question, but I think that's a great one that I haven't looked at in a while, and I need to look at that. So that's a really good question. That's a really good question.
And those numbers evolve, but it's basically, in round numbers, it's basically a $900 million investment to get $10 billion back. Yes. So that's kind of the way it originally came out. But of course, it's evolved over the last decade.
That's right. It's evolved a lot. So yes, no, that's a great question.
Who else has got questions for the comptroller? We only have a few more minutes of his time, and we really would like to capitalize on that. So I see Nadine Lee, the CEO of DART, is on. Would you like to ask your question, Nadine?
Hi, Nadine Leah Dart. Great to meet you, Comptroller Hager. I actually wasn't even a question. I just wanted to compliment you on thinking of the state employees and the possibility of increasing their compensation. I will fully support you in that effort. If there's anything we can do to help you with that, I'd be happy to do so. DART just went through an exercise in our last budget approval to increase compensation for our employees, and it's made a huge difference for the morale. And so if you need a testimony, just let me know.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And, I think as you're talking to your legislators and friends, if, please just kind of remind it. And that's the reason I make that, that inflation. Some people think when I'm talking about that, I'm trying to do it politically, it's this one's fault or that one. And I'm trying to talk about it because it's reality. and I've got employees that literally I will run into in different locations because that's their second job, and that's in normal times, where now if you add in the inflation, I mean, they're having to make really tough decisions, and they're doing the service. Without them, permits don't get issued. People don't get to expand their business, and so it's really critical. And I think that it's time now. Do I know that can we do an across the board for everybody to this amount? Probably not, but we can do across the board. But we can also target. What I try to do in my office is it's kind of like for our investments in a way. I make an example. When you're testing, your stress testing, and it's kind of what level of that stress test are you willing to absorb? And it's kind of the same thing. I look at all my different divisions as where are we losing people, and we're getting outside that comfort zone that I can't attrition and put people back in quick enough. And so I'm outside that kind of safety zone that I'm losing people more. And we've done some creative things, but also let's just be honest, pays a big piece. So I appreciate you saying that without a doubt. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Cookie Peden, you have a question for the comptroller.
Well, I would like an opinion from him, given the concerns with the utility infrastructure that we've had in the past with the electricity and the grid problems, and now with Atmos Energy having to increase and the challenges they faced this past cold spell. Is there anything that the state is looking at that can provide some relief for consumers? Because I constantly hear from consumers that we're picking up the tab for all these infrastructure failures. And I don't think that's really good press for our state.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. That's one reason that when I specifically mentioned infrastructure funding, I talked about the electrical grid, and in part, are we in a much better position than we were? Absolutely. I mean, we went through a very hot summer. We had a very cold spell, but let's be very clear: the cold spell that we went through was not Winter Storm Uri. We didn't have all the precipitation, so it may be degree wise pretty close to Winter Storm Uri, but it was not as an event wise because we didn't have that precipitation that the entire state had. Some areas had some, but my point being is we went through, it was tested, we met through those different levels, but that's one area because that infrastructure has to be paid for. I mean, somebody's going to be paying for it, and you and I know it typically goes to the ratepayers. So if we have these dollars and we can help incentivize and put those things in place, I think it's imperative. One of the things that I'm still working on, and most people are not aware of, that all of these the gas providers in Winter Storm Uri paid astronomical prices because the spot price was higher, and they have bonded 1 year short term to be able to pay off those debts. And one of the things that I am making a point to the legislators when they pass some legislation to enable amortizing that debt over a course of several years, and that would be put on our utility bills, those of us that are paying gas. And so my concern is that will be amortized over time with increases because of borrowing costs, where now the state has dollars that we didn't think we were going to have 2 years ago, and we probably should just pay that off. And some people can say, oh, well, that's a corporate bailout. Well, the reality is you and I are going to pay for it. I mean, that's who's going to pay. Ratepayers are going to pay for it. And the question is do we want to pay for it with dollars we have, and we don't have to pay interest on 15 years and have it on our bills? And I just think that's a cheaper way to do it. So that's a discussion that we're trying to have right now, which that doesn't immediately lower bills, but that'll prevent them from going up is my point. So I think it's two different components. That's why also I talked about that infrastructure, because the more the state can help put dollars in while we have it, which is dollars we've paid, then that will lessen additional increases or burden put on us as ratepayers in the future. So I think it's a great question, Cookie.
Speaking of infrastructure, David Kreis, if you have a question particularly about water. David, are you on?
Sure, yes, sir. I dropped my question in the chat there. Just really wanted to hear more specifics about funds that'll flow into infrastructure projects for transportation and water. I mean, just personally, water is a overall concern of mine with the influx of population. So I just want to hear more about that. Thank you, sir, for your time.
Thanks, David. I appreciate that. One of the things that I did last fall, I do a tour on different industry sectors or some issue twice a year, one in the spring and one in the fall. Obviously, we did broadband in the spring because that was a new job that we were given, and I needed to get across the state and listen to people. The one that I did in the fall was water infrastructure funding. And part of that was because we were in a record drought. And I felt like while you're in a drought, it tends to be on front and center of more people's mind. You can get people's attention. So, as you probably know, the state has put in more capabilities for borrowing on the local level to lower those costs to get projects going. However, one of the things is we are growing so rapidly, as you mentioned, and going higher than what, I think the demographers have assumed, especially I think the pandemic has accelerated people coming to Texas. In part, their pain threshold to leave a state lessened because they don't have to take every single one of their workers anymore. They can downsize the exec suite per se, or the corporate headquarters and relocate. So it appears though we're having significant stress. So there are federal dollars because of the federal infrastructure bill that are going to come to Texas additionally than what we had in the past for both water as well as for road infrastructure. But unfortunately, inflation has actually eaten away on the road side. For example, it's almost just covering what TxDOT is additionally putting in part. And so it's not, on one hand, it's a benefit because we're not going to have to build fewer roads, but it doesn't necessarily give us more roads that we can expand or redo. I'm still trying to, with my team and with Water Development Board, really try to understand the water side of that component. But one aspect is, I mentioned water because with the growth, the question becomes, do we need to add an additional infusion of dollars over into that water planning and being able to get projects on the ground? So the legislature's not identified a certain amount of money. There's certain groups that are coming and asking for certain amounts of group. I'm not advocating for a specific dollar amount right now because I'm not sure exactly what those federal dollars are. So that doesn't necessarily answer your question for specificities, but at least it answers the question in several moving pieces that can hopefully provide some additional infrastructure funding in the state of Texas. Let's see, do we have one more?
I don't see any others. Here's Matt. Is that Matt Marchbanks? Matt's iPhone 13.
All right, for able accounts. Yeah, I see that if Matt wants to. So we have, just real quick, we have the 529 accounts for some of them, the state side of it. So we handle those in my shop. And then also the able accounts, which several years ago, the federal government enabled accounts for those with certain disabilities to be able to save more dollars and essentially not have to exhaust all of their personal funding before they can have federal dollars and get certain capabilities. So the ABLE funds were created here in Texas. It was provided to my office, which have been going very well. People are saving, putting money away. I forget the exact amount that you can put off to the side in the ABLE accounts, but they've actually worked very well. And so what we did is we brought in advisory group of the disabilities community. They worked with us. We still have communications with them quite a bit, but we did a lot of things, worked with our vendors to make sure that people would not have to have fees on their cards that they could utilize to use those funds. So actually, I think that it's actually gone pretty well so far.
Glenn, I don't see any additional questions, but we simply can't thank you enough for being here today and sharing your thoughts and perspectives. When we saw the numbers come out on Monday, there had been some prognosticators that had thought the number was going to be higher than what was originally proposed. But wow, it's quite a number. But I also thought it was very appropriate for you to kind of caution everyone and say, you know, this is a once every biennium kind of opportunity. It's just not. Do not expect to see this happen at the next opportunity to go into in the 89th legislative session. So, but I think that was really helpful for everyone's perspective. And thank you for all you do for this great state. And thank you for all you have historically done as well in your multiple roles in serving the citizenry of Texas. So, any other comments, questions for Glenn before we release him? Because he is on a timeline right now, and he's already gone over his timeline. But any other questions or comments? All right. Well, thank you, Glenn. We really appreciate it. And
appreciate it, everybody. Good to see you. Hope you all have a great day, great week, and look forward to working with you more. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much. And just real quickly, wanted to acknowledge not only Glenn, but also Erica and her introduction. Also wanted to thank our sponsors once again for the great contributions to making sure that we are informing and engaging during this legislative session. And so thank you to all of our sponsors. And most importantly, thank to all of you for your interest and your support and your focus, because this is a very important time. We have as Erica told us, we have 137 more days in which to make some significant impact with a financial situation that is literally unheard of, and one in which we have many, many opportunities to invest in this great state. So if with that, I was going to mention to Glenn that we are making a contribution in his honor to our nonprofit of the year selected by Deborah Stogie, and that's United to Learn. And so that we will be doing that at the end of our fiscal year, which coincidentally is in about 2 weeks. So thank you all for being here today. Thank you all for your interest and support. We will leave this line open for a few minutes, just if anybody wants to do any additional networking. But thanks again for your interest, and look forward to seeing you at future series events relative to the legislative session.